Good evening. My name's Ira Katznelson. I teach political science and history here at Columbia, and it's my privilege to serve as a deputy director of Columbia World Projects, which is the home, the institutional home for the Center for Political Economy, the organization that is sponsoring this evening's events. It's also my great privilege to serve as one of three center co-directors with our colleagues Suresh Naidu and Katharina Pistor. Suresh, as you will know, is in economics and SEPA, and Katharina in law. The center was founded roughly 3 years ago with the ambition to work across disciplines to develop fresh ideas and scholarship and advance a public conversation about fundamental questions. Questions that concern such subjects as the organization of firms, the character of work and labor, issues that relate to money and banking, and the political economy of climate. Questions that concern not only the United States, but the globe. We are concerned to better understand the connections between scholarly knowledge and policy making. We are thinking about how to make questions of power, equality, and uncertainty central to these inquiries. And most relevant for tonight, we're concerned to probe the relationship between the economy and democracy. This evening's question, what if the economy worked for democracy, was originally posed for an event that was to have taken place in February, some 14 months ago, February of last year. But that event was undone by the season's only blizzard, canceled by snow. But since both our key words, democracy and economy, have faced a different kind of blizzard, even those who might have anticipated the results of the presidential election before it took place will have been surprised at the administration's radical policies. The purge of the civil service, the assault on independent institutions, including law firms, mainstream journalism, and universities, shifts from legislative to executive power, and a pervasive use of fear, as well as the emergence, they also might have been surprised by the emergent crisis for the American and global economy. With a set of fresh conundrums and surprises literally developing hour by hour. None of us, I believe, had quite anticipated the degree of current peril. Our question, what if the economy worked for democracy, challenges us beyond current events. It is basic, fundamental, essential. We badly need analytical and theoretical perspectives. We are so very fortunate, therefore, to have with us and to hear in a moment from three quite remarkable colleagues, Josh Ober, Katharina Pistor, and Jim Robinson. These colleagues will proceed in alphabetical order, and they'll speak for some 7 or 10 minutes each to jumpstart our collective conversation. A simple word about each, as extended introductions truly are not necessary. Josiah Ober holds appointments in political science, classics, and philosophy at Stanford University. From the vantage of the ancient Greek world, he has written about democracy then and now, as well as matters of expertise, dignity, and economic growth. His most recent book is The Greeks and the Rational, the Discovery of Practical Reason. Katharina Pistor who was here, as I said, in law at Columbia, and leads the Center for Political Economy's Idea Lab on money and finance, is a leading scholar of that subject from the perspective of comparative law and institutions, who, among other matters, probes property rights and corporate governance. Her most recent book is The Code of Capital: How the Law Creates Wealth and Inequality. And James Robinson is an economist and political scientist at the University of Chicago, where he directs the Pearson Institute for the Study, for the study and resolution of global conflicts. My father at this point would have said, and good luck to you. But they deeply concerned to understand relationships linking the formation and character of institutions to matters of prosperity and democracy. His most recent book, with Darren Acemoglu, is The Narrow Corridor: States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. And Jim, as you know, is a 2024 Nobel Laureate in Economic Sciences. Josh, on to you.
Thank you very much, Ira. I just want to say what a privilege it is to be here, to have a chance to talk with such distinguished colleagues, and to talk about what I think is, one of the really important questions of our time. So what kind of economy is most likely to work for democracy? And I'll just put out that I think it is a properly, not overly regulated market economy rather than a top-down state-managed economy. And why is that? Well, first, because I think at a certain level of abstraction, the underlying logic of a rule-bound democracy, understood as self-government by citizens who insist on no boss but ourselves and the rules we set for ourselves, such a democracy is in relevant ways similar to a well-regulated market economy. Both are based on the aggregation of preferences and information. So Friedrich Hayek's mid-century papers on the use of information in society concerned the question of price formation. So his conclusion was that top-down, centralized executive authority, management of prices for goods and services, is inevitably worse in outcomes than a free market, because the market aggregates a great deal of highly dispersed knowledge relevant to the current value of any commodity, that is, barring monopoly, deception, criminality, and so on. So likewise, the deliberation, bargaining, and voting decision-making processes of a well-organized democracy organize the diverse preferences and interests of citizens, and they bring to the bargaining table, or if you will, to the solution space, a wide range of useful information relevant to policymaking. This is in contrast to the closed information bubble within which an authoritarian executive necessarily operates. So my point is that a fairly high level of abstraction, admittedly, the use of knowledge, logic of a market economy is conceptually similar to democracy, just as the logic of a managed economy is similar to that of an authoritarian government. So next, I think we have strong reason to believe that democracy is correlated with, and very likely a cause of, economic growth, and that democracy is strongly correlated with a properly regulated market economy, that is, one that pushes back against monopoly and deception and elite capture. This is true whether we're talking about modernity or, to take an out-of-sample case, the one I can actually claim to know something about, the world of ancient Greek city-states, about 1,000 independent city-states in the classical era. So in that era, in Greek antiquity, economic growth was, I have argued anyway, driven by citizen-centered institutions. And that's most evident, but not limited to, the well-documented Athenian democracy. So finally, it seems very plausible to claim that in antiquity, as today, the causality arrow does not point in just one way. That is, there are likely to be positive as well as potentially negative feedbacks from a well-organized market economy to a workable democracy through raising standards of living for ordinary citizens who thereby have, at least in principle, more time and incentive to participate in democratic governance. That is, under the right conditions, a market economy can both can and does work for democracy. Of course, conditions may not be right. So an obvious point that seems to me to be borne out by history, that is, the virtuous market democracy cycle works best, perhaps only, when income inequality remains within tolerable limits. And that means progressive taxation on the wealthy and especially on the very wealthy. Examples of this kind of managing to keep it within bounds, inequality within bounds, include Athens in the 4th century BCE, when we can measure it roughly, and in the US in the generation following the end of the Second World War. So the problem is, obviously enough, that great wealth does translate into political power, one way or another, and at least some of the extremely wealthy will seek to capture the government in their own interest if they can. And therefore, as the Greeks knew, oligarchy is a constant threat to democracy. So what is required is a civic bargain that ensures meaningful equality of political influence for all citizens, which requires, for example, ensuring adequate levels of education, health, and basic welfare for all citizens, while keeping the elite secure enough in the enjoyment of their after-tax income to encourage ongoing investment in productive economic activity rather than, say, hoarding or plotting coup d'etat. And it requires incentives for elites to pay taxes willingly and that they invest their capital in ways that are socially valuable as well as personally profitable. And that's a tough balancing act, but not impossible. The key is having a genuinely democratic decision-making process, whether by direct or accountable direct democracy by citizens as at Athens, or accountable representatives, constrained by the rule of law. And finally, I think the hardest part, it requires a culture in which citizens recognize that they are better off within an imperfect democratic bargain than they are outside of it. So democratic decision-making requires ongoing negotiations and compromises. That is, it requires bargaining. All relevant interest groups involved in the bargaining process need to recognize that they, at the end of the current bargaining session, when we're bargaining over whatever policy we're going to be set, they're going to fail to get their most preferred outcome. Nobody gets their most preferred outcome, whether that is, for example, maximizing redistribution, perhaps for the relatively poor, or eliminating progressive taxation for the rich. So there's not going to be, in a democracy, a libertarian dream world of pure markets, maybe the world that Hayek really imagined would emerge, but nor is there going to be a progressive dream world of perfect social justice. Of course, both sides and all sides may and indeed will bargain again on another day, and all sides can continue to advocate for their preferred outcomes to drive for what they think is the better outcome. But if markets are to work for democracy and democracy is to work for markets, then citizens need to recognize that the fundamental democratic ideals of political liberty, equality, and the dignity of citizens do indeed make serious demands on all citizens and make special demands on the very wealthy, but those democratic ideals do not equate with the complete individual equality of outcome in terms of income or wealth. So where are we now? Well, I'm not Pollyanna. the USA is not in April of 2025 in a good place in regard to the economy working for democracy or vice versa. Thucydides, one of my favorite authors, wrote about Athenian fears of a tyrannico-oligarchic plot against the democracy in 415 BC, and those fears eventually were fulfilled when oligarchic coups overthrew democracy in 411 and again in 404. Athenian democracy was eventually restored on a sound basis, but only after a bloody civil war. Today, the oligarchical or the tyrannico-oligarchy hybrid is the norm, for example, in Russia or mutatis mutandis, China, Venezuela, and the US. Well, you combine the optics of Trump's inauguration with the lineup of tech industry giants, each a large-scale contributor to his inauguration, with the record of the Trump administration in the last several months. I suppose it fears that the US is at the tipping point and potentially in danger of collapsing into a North American version of that tyrannico-oligarchic pattern seems to me to be not really overblown. And with the possible exception of China, the economic record of tyranny oligarchy is not encouraging. If we look to past history, we can moreover expect that an executive that is unconstrained by the rule of law is likely to be a government-managed economy. So Hayek, among many others, I think, would have much to say, and not in a complimentary way, about the attempts to retool the American economy by economic government fiat. With the collapse of American democracy comes the potential for the collapse of widely shared economic prosperity. We'll know sooner or later whether that double whammy actually comes to pass. So what is to be done here and now by those of us engaged in higher education? Well, for me, it's working to restore the education of citizens as a central goal of colleges and universities, but that's probably a topic for another day.
Thank you very much, Josh. Katharina.
Yes, thank you. So let me clarify that my starting point is not just any economy, but a capitalist economy. And I think that there is an important difference between a market economy and a capitalist economy. I like to describe a capitalist economy as a market economy on legal steroids. And that brings me to the question of what is the role of law in this game. So the legal steroids basically give capitalists privileges that are backed by state power, that put them in a position to be stronger and quicker and more durable than anybody else. So in the Code of Capital, the book that has been mentioned before, I'm basically saying, just give me any object, any promise to future payment, or any idea, and with the right legal coding, which is property rights, collateral law, trust, corporate law, bankruptcy law, and of course contracts, I can flip this interest into a wealth-generating and wealth-protecting asset. But you need the law, you can't do it without the law. So then the question is, how does the relationship between law and capital and a capitalist economy evolve over time? I think once you have these institutions in place, and I think you can trace some of them back to Roman law for sure, some of them emerged in the Middle Ages. The trust is a relatively recent institution, but quite important, can be traced back to the 11th century to the use, but is mostly a 16th and 17th century instrument. These institutions are critical for creating capital, and the importance is also that they are enforceable by the state. So you can't disentangle an economy from the state, and you can't disentangle economic power from state power. Private economic power is built in law. What is interesting is that I think modern democracies and constitutional democracies have tried time and again to restrain capitalism's excesses. Most importantly, of course, after World War II, or in this country, in the New Deal of the 1930s, then again after every major crisis, most recently, of course, after the global financial crisis. What is interesting for me, and that's kind of a puzzle that I pose to myself, is why actually is it that a system that is so deeply coded in law is so resistant to legal governance? Because we can't regulate it. We just don't regulate the market economy very well, certainly not a capitalist economy very well. When we try, it just takes a couple of years, sometimes decades, for private actors to find ways to use the private legal system to code around the legal constraints, and we're back to where we were. So my answer to that puzzle is that that we have a particular organization of our legal systems. It's a duality of law. We have public and we have private law, and they're based on very different logics. Our public law, our constitutional democratic law, influences public law as a way of somehow expressing a collective bargain over how we want to govern ourselves. Our private law is geared towards private autonomy and individual, you could say, self-expression in the most freedom-enhancing way, but you could also say domination over others. Because the private law allows you to exert power over others, whether you do this through property rights, whether you do this nowadays through contracts, because we do not bargain anymore. We all sign boilerplate contracts, either online or in person, over which we don't even have a choice to bargain. These are take it or leave it options that are dictated to us. Most of our counterparties are not free individuals on the other side, but are corporations and corporate actors that claim personality for themselves, not only legal personality, that's of course what they are, but they've also increasingly claimed the kind of human rights that were first created for humans, which is not only property rights, but the right to free speech, which you express in this country by paying money, or even the right to religious freedom. So how is it that the system is so resistant to legal governance? Why can't we do this? Because I think this is baked in the logic of private law. So we have two different logics, the collective logic and the private individual autonomy logic, which can lead to domination, and I think it does lead again to domination. The logic of private law is private legal empowerment. We empower contractors, we empower, of course, private owners. If you have the resources to do so, you can dictate your terms to somebody else. And the inequality and inequity in this arrangement is disguised by the fact that we simply live on the premise that formal equality is all that we're looking at. We're not looking for real substantive equality, but only formal equality. So that's the first reason why private law can always undo what we do in public law. I should add to this, of course, that since our new modern constitutions have embraced the idea of individual rights, they protect these private autonomy rights also at the constitutional level, making it almost impossible to fight against it. The second mechanism that allows private law to get around or capture public law time and again is that, yes, the state represents the centralization of the means of coercion, but access to the means of coercion is highly decentralized. That's what we call litigation. So if you can access the courts, if you have the resources to do so, also if you can comply with the civil procedure requirements to even get into court, you're always better off with an individual claim than a collective claim. You're always better off with a kind of an individual right that has been recognized before than otherwise. And of course, you're much better off if you have resources than if you don't have resources. You can litigate. And as Mark Gallanter has said already in the 1970s, those with resources are in this game not for an outcome in a particular case, but they're in this game for the rules. They want to change the rules, and they strategically litigate to change the rules. So that's the second. And the third aspect that allows private law to push back against public attempts, public law attempts to regulate it time and again, is what I call legal arbitrage and the tolerance for legal arbitrage. So at some level, legal arbitrage is impossible because every law is sufficiently ambiguous and open-ended and incomplete, as economists would say, that you can find ways to interpret it in a different way. And if you have multiple rule settings, you have local rule and state law and federal law and international law and other domestic law, you can actually play this game really, really well. As one of my colleagues with whom I co-taught for many years has said, regulations are like a scaffolding, and if you want to do something good for your client, you have to find a new financial asset or intermediary that fits through the gaps of the scaffolding in order to basically say it is legal even though it violates the purpose of the law. So these three mechanisms together, with a strong impetus of our constitutional law as well, basically give priority to private self-ordering all the way to private domination through law. And so my conclusion from that is basically to say, the economy in a capitalist system cannot work for democracy. Its inherent logic is for private autonomy, including power over others, and there are no constraints. We don't have the same kind of accountability mechanisms, checks and balances, or constraints or rights against other private parties that we do have against the state. So we always have to go through the state, but the state itself is constrained by those with the resources to use the law against it. So we find ourselves in this predicament that I think I would characterize the current situation in the US. It is an oligarchy in many ways, but I would characterize the moment, especially with Musk and its team, it's like a hostile takeover by the logic of the private law of our state systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jim, you can follow this optimistic note.
And now for something completely different. So since let me try to talk about something else, as a way of sort of throwing a different sort of perspective on this from like my own kind of intellectual trajectory, which despite the way those books might look like, has always been like trying to understand the developing world and the economic and political structures of the developing world. And so I want to talk about neither a market economy nor a capitalist economy, and talk about the relationship between the economy and democracy. But I always think, like, as soon as you start talking about the economy, you're already going off in the wrong direction, because I just think I've never thought it made any sense to talk about this thing called the economy as if it was some sort of autonomous zone of like action. And so I'd like to resist I probably won't be able to stop myself, but I'd like to resist talking about that. And I thought I would give a kind of example, from my own experience of the interaction between the economy and democracy and economic institutions and political institutions. And it's a very specific example from which I've been studying for a few years in eastern Nigeria. It's a village called Umuchieze in Imo State in eastern Nigeria. So let me start talking about the economy and how the economy works, and then I can start talking about the politics, and we can think about how they kind of mutually constitute each other. And perhaps you're going to tell me by the end, that's not relevant for thinking about Donald Trump. And if you tell me that, I'm happy, actually. So what's the main asset? If you were an economist, you'd sort of look at it and say, well, land. That's the main asset. So who owns the land? What are the property rights to land? Well, there's 4 extended kinship groups called kindreds, and the land is owned collectively by the kindred. So no one has private property rights to land. The kindreds collectively own the land. And if you want to get access to the land, you have to be part of a kindred. Okay, you can petition the elders in the kindred, and everybody who's part of that kindred has a right to access to land. Okay? But actually, land is not that valuable in eastern Nigeria. You can grow cassava and yam, but you can't make much money growing cassava and yam. People are much more valuable than land. And in fact, they would say, actually, there's wealth in people. Your real wealth is not in the land. The land has symbolic meaning, but the real wealth is in the people. And in fact, the people is where the money is, especially the people not in eastern Nigeria, the people in New York City, or the people in Milwaukee, or the people in London. So you have this immense kind of social network, but there's sort of norms and mechanisms that tie that network. It makes it kind of creates wealth for people in the village. And one of the mechanisms is, if you're born in the village, your umbilical cord is buried in the village. So you're kind of tied to the village. The Igbo philosopher Francis Njoko says, like the Igbo person is like a tethered goat. You can stray from the village, but you're tethered to the village, because you have to be buried there. So the diaspora is very powerful as a social network because of the way it's tied to the village. It's not like me. I grew up in a little village in the middle of England. I was out of there, I never go back. I'll never go back. But you can't do that because you're so tied in a kind of fundamental way to the village, And so that's a great thing because you're making money in Houston and Milwaukee. And you're giving back. You give to the wealth spreads through the network because there's enormous impulse towards redistribution. Okay, you can be very successful. Economic success is valued, it's respected, it's honored, there's prestige, but you have to contribute. Okay, and the way to think about contributing also is not like charity. You're not giving anyone to anything. It's not like altruism. People have rights to all of that, you know, because we're all in this together. And you have, just like you have rights to access to land, you have rights to other people's kind of economic success. Okay, so there's a system of sort of rights over these wealth, over the generation of wealth, just like there's rights to access to land. So there's these kindreds, there's the land, there's people all over the world, there's redistribution. You know, people come, they build a fancy house in the village. You know, there's no, you know, like no one's hiding anything because you know you contribute. Okay, so what does the political system look like? Well, every kindred has a sort of assembly, but that's not where the real action is. There's a village assembly called the Aladimna, where every person can take part. Okay, now, is that a democracy? Could be. You know, it's a very Athenian, you could say, participatory democracy. Everyone can take part. Decisions are made by consensus in an interesting way. You know, so why are decisions made by consensus? Well, you know, I think, what does this do, this democracy? And you'll see I'm actually going to come to a point. You know, not much. You know, there's some need for coordination. You know, the teacher at the school didn't get paid by the federal government, so we have to chip in to pay the... There's a lot of problems with insecurity in eastern Nigeria, so you want to organize the youth to protect the village. So there's public goods and stuff you kind of coordinate and organize. But at some level, none of the kindreds surrendered sovereignty to this thing. Mm-hmm. It kind of... And part of the reason that I've sort of decided that they're so obsessed with like consensus and everyone can speak, everyone has a, you know, is there's this sort of veto power. You know, there's a veto power. So the way anthropologists would talk about this, you know, in Africa would be there's limited jurisdictions. You know, there's political institutions, but the political institutions, you know, I think when we think about democracy and you talk about democracy, you're thinking of this sort of transformative thing. We created this political institution to transform society, you know, and they don't, that's not how the way they think about political institutions. Political institutions are not there to transform society. There's limited jurisdictions. The rights and sovereignty are in society, in the kinship group, and they have very strong principles of access, of people's rights, of distribution, access to land, of, you know, whatever, rights, reciprocities, etc. So I don't think they think of democracy in this way, you know, and that, you know, and I think maybe this is part of the problem, you know, in Western society. You know, so if I thought about the question that we started with, which is, you know, does the economy support democracy? Like, first of all, I find that really difficult to kind of think about because these things are all mutually sort of constituted. There's a set of rights, there's a set of practices. Some of them look like political practices or even democratic practices. No one's getting elected. You know, nobody's really voting on anything, actually. Nobody votes on anything. You know, you just kind of decide. Sometimes people will summarize, okay, what did we agree to? Did we agree to that? And then there'll be another debate will start on, no, I don't think we actually did agree to that. And then the discussion will start again. So is that democracy? I don't know. I'll leave others to decide. You know, but at some fundamental level, of course, nobody's landless, you know. Everyone has access to economic resources. Everyone has access to other people's resources and other people's kind of economic success. So there's a sort of collective rights in all these income streams and assets. And you know, but it's very different from the way we sort of tend to think about the relationship between the economy and democracy. And I think that's partly because we have this idea of we create these political institutions to radically transform sort of society, you know, and we just had a radical transformation society implemented by less than a plurality of the population. So maybe the Africans have something to teach us about that.
Yeah. We're going to have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll also open up later to the audience for questions. As I forewarned you, I'm going to ask the following question, but then I will come back to some very specific points raised in each of the presentations. Is there, for example, is it relevant or not to think about a differentiated institutional spheres or not? Jim, you're suggesting for many purposes not. The distinction between market and capitalism is worth investigating. And the distinction between direct democracy and representative democracy, or what the kind of democracy that our colleague at Harvard, Jenny Mansbridge, calls friendship democracy, in which we all gather as friends to deliberate, and you're describing that in the East Nigerian case, versus adversary democracy, in which we're assumed to have competing preferences and interests. So we'll come to all that as time permits. But my first question is the following. Given current events, I found myself drawn back to 3 books written in the 1930s and 1940s. So there's Joseph Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy. The preface to the first edition was written in 1942. But earlier than that is, Schumpeter, I'm now radically simplifying. Let's call him a conservative economist. But he also projected the end of capitalism based on its own successes. So that's his own language, and believed that the relationship of socialism and democracy need be the main subject, which is the concluding third of that book. I'm not now asking for comments on Schumpeter. Elie Halevi's Era of Tyranny. Halevi was a great French liberal who didn't much like conservatism and didn't much like, certainly didn't like Bolshevism or and so on. And then there's kind of broadly speaking social democrat, Karl Polanyi's 1944 Great Transformation. What is striking to me about each one of these is 2 things that resonate with the remarks so far. First, they are all in some deep sense institutionalists. That is, they are asking how should rules, both formal and informal, be crafted to minimize the prospects of authoritarianism, to minimize the prospects of tyranny. They all ask that question. Second, they all have in their heads a kind of bundle of public policies. I was very struck, as some people know, I've been very interested in the New Deal. They all reference the New Deal as they don't talk always about American economy or American democracy. They talk about New Deal democracy, New Deal economy, and that meant the kind of regulated world that, Josh, you were talking about. And they each have quite different views about whether such a regulated economy would, democratically regulated, would in fact produce durable outcomes. My question is this unfair question. If each of you were sitting in your study now and thinking under current crisis conditions, you want to sketch a book you would call perhaps The Great Transformation, perhaps The Era of Tyrannies, perhaps Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. What would you put up front? How would you identify the puzzle and the potential architecture of how to proceed? And I ask that because each of you, in your own way, is a profound institutionalist. And I'm really curious about how you would bring your institutionalism to bear on that kind of intellectual, architectural project. Who would like to start?
Go ahead, please.
I'm happy to
Katharina.
start. I'm cheating a little bit because I've just finished a book, which is called The Law of Capitalism and How to Transform It.
Oh, right.
A little nod to Mr. Polanyi. And the book tells part of the story or expands on the story that I told you before, but it also tries to do something which I found incredibly challenging, which is to say, can we go beyond capitalism and capitalist law? Because that's what I would like to do. I want to make clear that I don't think that the only alternative is socialism or that kind of state-led collectivism. What I ended up with is basically arguing that it has a lot to do with the normative foundations of our legal systems and the incongruence of the normative foundations for public or democratic law versus private law. And so I'm basically arguing for a reset of the normative foundations for private law. So I'm not against individuals making choices or individuals bargaining with one another. I'm also not even against private property. I teach corporations. I still have, but maybe because of that, have some deep reservations about some the ways in which that particular model has been used, but I don't think it's as such evil. So I'm very tolerant on the institutions. What I find myself wrestling with is the linkage between institutional structures, norms, and power.
Great. Jim or Josh?
Well, I think I'm not. I don't have another book, a new book. But if I did,
Imagine one. Yes.
The African book.
No,
if I did, I think it's like, for me, it seems like the biggest challenge for institutionalists. If I could stay on the theme that I sort of started on, like non-Western kind of institutions, would be thinking about what political institutions are actually sort of consistent with capitalism, or I think like the traditional thought that I was educated in and which I perhaps contributed to was sort of suggest that there's this particular mapping from types of political institutions to capitalist, etc., capitalism, etc. But the biggest challenge to that is the rise of China in the last 50 years. While you might say in the economic sphere it's a very sort of capitalist economy, in the political sphere it looks radically different from what you'd have thought by studying the connection between political institutions and economic success in the Western world. So I think what fascinates me is there much more kind of cultural relativism in some sense, in the political underpinnings for successful capitalism than we previously thought.
Excellent.
So I'll also cheat a bit. I co-authored a book that came out a little year ago, since the rational, which was called, it's not an academic book, so there's no particular reason you would have noticed it. It's called The Civic Bargain. And the argument was that democracy ought to be thought of as self-government by citizens in the first instance. And if you want that, and we recognize that some people don't. Some people don't want to govern themselves. They're perfectly happy to be governed by someone else. We think that's a mistake, but that's a mistake people have the right to make. If you want that, we suggest that there's certain conditions that have to be fulfilled. And the first condition is just simply you have to be able to deliver the goods that any state organization is going to deliver, and that's basically security and some level of welfare. But then you've got to go out and figure out how you're going to do that without a top-down control. And that means you're going to have to figure out very difficult things. If we're talking about self-government by citizens, you have to figure out who's a citizen. And you have to face the circularity of it's going to be the citizens who are going to decide who is the citizen. And you have to bite down on that hard question. And then you're going to have to recognize that it is about bargaining because it's going to be in a pluralistic society. And therefore you're going to have difference of interests. So what is it that's going to make possible that sort of bargaining? And then here we go to sort of Jenny Mansbridge stuff. We say that you have to accept the idea that your fellow citizens are civic friends. Doesn't mean you like them. Doesn't mean you want to have a beer with them. But it does mean they're not your enemies. And they're not people you're trying to defeat. And how do you then sustain civic friendship? Well, that's where we get down to it has to be education of citizens, because it's not easy. So anyway, that's the book I want to write. If you want to get the whole thing, you really have to go there.
So just to follow up on these very interesting sets of comments, and I'll stick to Mansbridge for a while. In this book, which everyone should read, Beyond Adversary Democracy, Professor Mansbridge wrote that as a young colleague who'd been very active in the New Left and in participatory democracy, and looked to Athens as a kind of as a model. And she studied New England town meetings and a women's rape crisis group. But she also emerged very critical of the possibilities of direct civic democracy, saying that, well, oligarchies developed. Some people had more rhetorical skills than others. Some were richer than others, etc. So that the friendship assumption could, under some circumstances, mask hierarchy and inequality, just as adversary democracy can have. So I'm curious about, within each of your cases, in a way, within the world of Athens, within the world of private and public law, and within the world of Eastern Nigeria, how can the civic sensibility, does it operate with or without hidden hierarchies? And so not just the public hierarchy, but the private hierarchies. And what are the implications of that for the imbrication, the linkages between economy and politics, economy and democracy? I don't know if I've asked that clearly, but I'm profoundly provoked by the three sets of comments. Jim?
Oh, well, I mean, there is definite hierarchy, but there's, I would say, and there's institutionalization of hierarchy through like titles. You can take titles, and titles bring prestige, and you have to spend money to get titles, and so there's a but I would say that's achieved status, from that perspective. But there's definitely hierarchy, and there's definitely you have a title, you're going to speak first in the assembly, almost certainly, and. So I don't think anyone has any problem with hierarchy, but there's some things that you can't override, and hierarchy you have to contribute also. So, but there's definitely hierarchy for sure. Yes, I think there's for me in any society there's always these. I'm British, for heaven's sake. I mean, so Britain is a careful balance of hierarchy and and democracy, and we have the House of Lords, and we still love all that stuff, so that you have to make compromises. Every society is a kind of compromise, I think.
Josh?
I mean, certainly in Athens there remain hierarchies in that there are people who are substantially wealthier than other people. That's certainly known. And in the political realm, there are those who are known to be, in a sense, the usual speakers in the assembly. So a lot of my early work was the question of how do you avoid that group simply becoming the government, capturing the government. And so one of the ways you can try to get at it, at least so I argued, is looking at the political rhetoric, which I have a lot of it preserved from Athens. And what you see is, in order for an elite speaker to get, in a sense, the attention of the audience, it was imperative that he, and this is all male citizenship, so it's he, establishes bona fides as a democratic citizen, as someone who's, and he had to show that his life, in fact, had been manifestly that of a democratic citizen, and that his opponents, because there is an adversarial counterpart to this are not that. They are crypto oligarchs, can be shown to be such, and of course they're going to challenge the same thing to him. But that basically, if you are not able to demonstrate these bona fides, you will not be listened to in the assembly. So it doesn't matter how rich or powerful it is, that if you're not one of us, we won't listen to you. At the same time, we're not going to listen to you if we don't think we have something to learn from you. So you can indeed say, I have some special background. I've been studying this. I've really dedicated a lot of time. Other people don't understand Philip of Macedon the way I do. So you have to balance that expertise, in a sense, elite features of being an elite, with a deep commitment to the values of the common citizens. And I think that's very hard to maintain, and it's maintained normatively rather than through law. But I think it's absolutely essential. That's what you have to have if you want to keep an elite from ultimately capturing.
And you put great weight on the civic as a counterpoint, as it were.
Yeah, I think it's a point I think that you made earlier with your example is the question of reciprocity. What kind of expectations can we have vis-a-vis our fellow citizens, but maybe also non-citizens? And do we have actually also institutions and mechanisms in place to ensure that every one of us can make these claims on others that are affecting our lives? So I'm basically, in the book, I'm invoking the capabilities approach that Amartya Sen first developed, and then Martha Nussbaum further developed a little further, and which basically says every person has the right to live the life that they have reason to value. And that claim, Nussbaum is there more explicit than I think Sen is a claim against anybody, not against the state. And it's also not just can't be reduced just to a positive right against the state, but it's a claim that I can make against everybody. And so when I go back to my critique of the private law and the capitalism, it also should mean that I can make a claim against a corporation, against somebody else who's dominating. It could be my employer, that employer has an obligation to put me in a position that I can live a life that I have reason to value, which can be further institutionalized. But we don't have these mechanisms really. We're just saying consent, labor contract, done, right? And so under the disguise of formal equality, we can recreate hierarchy in a very deep way within private settings that is as pernicious, even sometimes more than state, especially since this is backed by state power as well. So I think how to create these relations of reciprocity beyond the clan is what I would be really interested in, because our societies are global, and the people who affect our lives are also very often players that are not part of our society but come from elsewhere.
A question about scale. Some of us heard a talk last week, Danny Roderick was here, and spoke about the question of global governance. But there's a lot of space between a village or a city or a town or a state or even a given country and the globe. There's a kind of many steps of potential governance as you go up and down, each with very different criteria of membership, and each presumably with ever thinner shared norms. So the village, everyone who begins life and ends life in the same place has a very thick sense of belonging and the meaning of reciprocity, the meaning of share, the meaning of choice, the constraints. To jump, and Athens, of course, itself had such, but it was a very small proportion, wasn't it? Or if we include all the humankind, those not eligible, not just by gender, but slaves, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a community, a democratic community of inside and outside. If you look to the United States, to use a phrase the historian Jack Green uses, we're an extended polity. We, in fact, have the same problems that the British had in governing the colonies of North America. We have Washington, but we have 50 units, and within those units there are thousands of other units. They don't seem to share a common, or do they share sufficiently a common civic understanding to constitute a universe of norms that can constrain and operationalize relations of economy and democracy, their integration in a way. And then if you move beyond the country to regional settings like the EU, or to the global, where do each of you has stressed the deep importance of shared understanding, of shared respect, of shared dignity, of shared rules, etc. But once you change the scale, what happens? And can this solution be maintained? Or must institutions then take a rather different form if economy and democracy are to thrive together?
I tend to think there are limits to scale.
Okay.
I think that scale is we claim in this book, The Civic Bargain, that scale is the great problem for democracy. And the question is then, how do you scale up? And how do you scale up to the point in which you can compete in a world of states with autocratic states? Because autocratic states scale really easily. You basically have,
Yes.
One person commands 10, commands, thousands. So how do you then scale a democracy? And I think there are ways to do it. Federalism, obviously, is one of the attempted institutional solutions. But I think that to the extent to which you break beyond a level in which we can indeed imagine ourselves, a citizenry, as part of a common enterprise with some kind of a shared history, some kind of at some level shared values, at some level a civic friendship that means we're not each other's enemies. When you exceed that scale, I don't see how democracy is possible, frankly. So I'm very skeptical about global governance that would be in any meaningful way democratic. Whether we can sustain it at the level of the United States, given polarization and so on, that's a big question now. I think it's conceivable, but I think it's going to take a lot of work.
And if we were to think about not the village, but Nigeria as a sovereign state, and these big words of economy and democracy, how does it scale up?
I mean, the way I think about that is, the problem in Nigeria is a sort of projection of European ideas of nation state into a completely inappropriate context, where there's no attempt to kind of build. I don't know if you can build a social contract at that level, but there was no attempt to ever do so, And in fact, what the British did was, create this kind of amoral zone. Achebe, the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe, in his book Man of the People, says this brilliantly, which was the last page of the book. He says, the village had a mind, and the village could say no to sacrifice. But in the affairs of the nation, there was no owner, and the laws of the village did not apply. But I don't think there's anything intrinsic to the Africans, in fact, the opposite. There's a paper just came out in the American Economic Review by Harvard economist Ben Enke and his collaborators. So Ben is very interested in what he calls moral universalism. Okay, so here's the survey question. So I give you $1,000, and I ask you to divide it between two people. Somebody who's kind of like close to you, like a member of your family, and somebody else, somebody from a different country or whatever. And the idea is, the more you split that thing equally, none of it's for you. How do you divide it? Do you divide it between someone kind of socially proximate to you or somebody else? And to the you're more moral universalist if you split it sort of 50-50. Okay. So the funny thing about that data is, which are the parts of the world which are most kind of universalist morally? Tanzania, Nigeria, Zambia, Malawi, it's all African countries. So that doesn't surprise me a bit. So I, like for me, I talked about wealth in people. Wealth in people is people. It's not just my family, it's everybody. Anyone who's worked in Africa knows that wealth in people, everyone wants to know everyone. You want to make social connections, you want to extend that network, you want to. So I mean, I don't have a plan. But maybe it's less challenging than we think. We're Africa's sort of trapped in this history that it's been trying to extricate itself from for 60 years. And there's places that have done that, in particular circumstances, Botswana, Somaliland, or whatever. But I think underneath it all, the Africans could do it, But it takes some enormous amount of re-engineering, obviously, at the level of political institutions.
Yeah. I mean, maybe building on that, there's a nice paper by Powell, who between networks and between market and hierarchies, and he talks about networks. So I think so the idea that we could have a democratic structure that could scale indefinitely, I agree with you. I think it's just impossible. And so the question is, could we have smaller scale self-governing bodies on maybe even different types of issues that would be kind of interoperable at some level? So can we just connect the clan to another clan rather than just thinking about within the clan is what is our structure? And I think we've done this in some respects. We've done this kind of with the internet. It's sort of also not perfect, but I think thinking about interoperable communication systems that are not necessarily in the hands of hierarchs, that would have to be restructured. I think many of the institutions would have to be restructured. But in some ways, I think this idea that the nation state is the model for an integrated universal governance system within which markets flourish and democracy can flourish, I think we have exhausted that system. I think it can no longer deal with the not only scale but also the complexity of modern societies. And so reorganizing who is in charge of what kind of problems and how can you make sure that you have sufficient participation of different people that also bring it's not only to legitimize the system, but also they bring different types of expertise and interests and priorities to the project. I think that's really the challenge. There are of course some new, there's open democracy, there's liquid democracy, there are theorists that think about this more, but that's the way I would think about this.
Each of you has been a critic here tonight, but elsewhere, of sort of rigidities of national sovereign states as such. But that's how the world is organized, and including our own country. So I think one of the puzzles where economics and politics meet is really how to do, is it possible to do, Katharina, what you've just said, which is a kind of layering or laddering of social relations, of networks, of association, with questions of sovereignty, decision-making, power, coercion. Government, ultimately, any policy has a coercive quality to it. It's enforced by law. Law has penalties if you don't follow them. And sometimes, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, Katharina, there can be a perverse effect. Individual rights, we're all for it, but individual rights can be utilized to preserve oligarchy and hierarchy of an unacceptable kind. Long-winded way to come to a question based on, and then we'll open up in a minute or two to the group. When Theda Skocpol has worked on the history of women's movements, various other social movements, civil rights, Tea Party, take among others. What she notes is a kind of reproduction of a federal logic within the organizational form of insurgents who are using democratic instruments to get change they want, women's suffrage, civil rights, or more limited government, as in Tea Party. And what they do is reproduce a federal logic so that the organizational form in a given town and at the state level and at the national level have a kind of homology or consistency. I take it that that's a model that is both constrained and made difficult by traditional sovereign power of the nation state, but may also be a way of coping with and of accelerating democratic prospects, including economic democratic prospects, within very different kinds of settings. Nigeria and China and the United States and India are all distinctive places with their own deep histories and social structures and the like. But this layering question seems to me to be quite important to what each of you has presented. Is that a fair summary?
Certainly,
Yeah.
certainly, even you just take a city-state like Athens, with a population at the outside of maybe 300,000 persons, of which at the maximum maybe 50,000 of them were adult male citizens. You look, we tend to think of Athens as just this sort of homogenous thing, the assembly and so on. But in fact, it has exactly this layering. Every Athenian became a citizen through their membership in a village or a neighborhood. It was not kinship based, but it was very locally based. So you don't get to be a citizen unless your fellow villagers or people in your neighborhood, when you become 18, say, yes, he is a legitimate member of us. He gets to be written into, in a sense, the list. And so, yeah, it does, and that works up to what gets called a tribal level, which is sort of, once again, misleading because it's very pseudo kinship, ultimately to the full citizen body. So yeah, I think almost democracy can't work, or that lots of movements that seem democratic can't work unless you have this kind of layering or a fractal effect, so that the small is reflected in the large.
I might just be repeating what I said at the beginning, because I also think we do have a kind of layering at the global level, but it's certainly not democratic. So if we think about global production chains, if we think about, of course, multinational corporations, if we think about the fact that most of the tradable financial assets are either coded in English or New York law, then we see the extraterritorial reach of many of our configurations that are deeply hierarchical, and I don't even think that the citizens of either New York State or England know that they're basically adopting the law that is used to code capital globally, which in fact they are. So I think these systems that we have, they're no longer contained to a particular territory and the sovereign, but they are extraterritorial, but especially in the extraterritorial effect as under colonialism. Today they're also even more hierarchical than they are in systems where you at least have democratic pushback. So I think the challenge is really to think about these global networked relations and in some ways democratize the economic relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess in Theda Skotspol's work, the organization is sort of adapting itself to the political institutions that it's trying to influence, so you try to influence at these different levels. So it makes sense to kind of adopt a kind of organizational form that allows you to do that efficiently. I mean, I think a good model for Nigeria is Switzerland. Actually, I have a friend who teaches at the University of Lausanne, and she says that when students submit a paper, they put their village name on the paper. You know, it's just like Nigeria. You know, I don't know if they bury their umbilical cord. You know, but if you think about the history of Switzerland, you know, like it took them what 600 years to get from like the first three cantons swear an oath, you know, on the hill outside Lucerne, and they kind of have a pact. And then they gradually, and then, you know, 600 years later, in the middle of the 19th century, they kind of have a central state, you know. Like, but sovereignty, it takes a long time and maybe never for sovereignty. Now, maybe, you know, that the world moves faster nowadays, but the Swiss model is very interesting in the sense of like a kind of more like what I have in mind as a legitimate structure, you know, where the center kind of coordinates or whatever. But there's still all the authority and identity is at that local level. But there's 3 languages in Switzerland, you know. I mean, there's, you know, it's a very cosmopolitan, globalized place, you know. So, you know, like I don't see those things to be in contradiction.
I think that's terrific, and I'm going to open up for questions, but I would note that each of the positive examples we have requires some form of membership. And one of the most vexing questions in the world today is who gets to be a member, especially in a world of such mobility, duress, and human heterogeneity. And the membership rules, as it were, in each site that we might know best are not just warmly welcoming, but also are restrictive. And sometimes implicitly, if you're not born in a village, you're not born in a village. Sometimes explicitly by immigration statutes, and sometimes coercively, as we're seeing in deportations occurring in the United States today. So if I can close, my 2 cents would be that one of the greatest challenges in thinking about the imbrication of economy and democracy is addressing the membership question. But let's open up. Questions, please.
Yes, thank you so much.
And kindly identify yourself.
Of course, I don't think this is on.
It's out, we can hear you.
Hello? Okay, I turned it on. Hi, my name is Alex. I am currently a senior in undergrad studying economics and mathematics. And thank you so much to the 4 professors here who gave really, really insightful remarks, and I learned a lot and I appreciate it. And my question is to all of you. At the very beginning of the event, Professor Ober raised a really interesting point, which is that the logic of market economy is really similar to the logic of a democracy. And based on this logic, I also think that because in market economy, there may be market failures. And in the democracy, would there be also similar market failures? For example, the example I can talk about is the rise of digital technology, social media platforms, where misinformation has been has transformed the market for ideas into a market for lemons, where you cannot distinguish the quality of the information that you receive, and therefore it may create a tremendous market failure in, for example, the propagation of information online. And also there might be the potential for a monopoly of narratives, monopoly for ideas through the frameworks that Professor Kaczynski just talked about, how laws tend to be captured, institutions tend to be captured by capitalists in the system. So I'm wondering, the first question is there a case for a stronger, I'm also short follow-up, yeah, a case for a strong state to intervene in this market, in this democracy, even whether it be elected or maybe autocratic, to intervene and protect the people from the potential dangers of market failures? And a quick second question.
No, one at a time. We got others.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Market failure, strong state.
think, there is, I think you're exactly right. I mean, market failure is certainly possible, or the democratic equivalent, and especially when it comes to the matter of communication, right? So if we basically say that democracy really works if we can aggregate our preferences and what we know, and we can bargain honestly with one another, it fails when we can't do that. So exactly right. The danger, of course, is the state becomes strong enough to control communication. At what point is it still self-government by citizens, or is it government by the experts who have the capacity and the power to control the mechanisms by which we communicate? I think there's a real danger there that a state that becomes that powerful is no longer government by citizens, even indirectly through representatives. So there's a real conundrum. I think that's a terribly difficult problem that we're confronting right now.
Good. Other questions? Please come to the. Go ahead.
Hi. First of all, public speaking.
Identify yourself.
Oh, I'm Ava. I'm a sophomore. Public speaking terrifies me, so please excuse me. So we talked about networks, and I was wondering, do networks hold value in the context of democracy if we conceive of them as only transactional? We discussed this idea of reciprocity, but I was wondering if any of you could specify if that's more to mean kind of an eye for an eye reciprocity, or if you're referring more to like cultural collectivism, and if that cultural collectivism is fundamentally incompatible with capitalism, essentially, in the United States. Thank you.
Or
Yes.
democracy.
Yes.
So cultural collectivism.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point, and I think for me, the network idea is and the reciprocity is kind of built into. So networks are basically networks of people that are connected through different things. Could be communication systems, something else. So we can have a whole debate about what kind of networks can emerge and how. But let me just go to the question about cultural collectivism. Reciprocity is not transactional. I think one of the problems of the logic of private law, as I described it, is actually that everything becomes transactional. There's actually an interesting reference. I discussed this today with my students in my class. That Peter Evans had this wonderful classification of states as either being predatory or developmental. And the predatory states had very similar characteristics as the most corrupt states that you can possibly imagine, because for everything there's a price tag. Right, so he says, writing in the 1980s or early, he says it's Zaire, right? So everything is up for grabs and everything can be bought. And I guess in the U.S., Washington, we're getting pretty close to that. So that's not what I mean. But reciprocity is sort of more in the caring. You can say cultural collectivism, but you could also say in the individual capabilities tradition, it's basically, I also have a claim that you help me to get the conditions so I can make my life choices in a meaningful way. And it's not a bilateral thing, but it's a claim towards a collective within which I live.
Just briefly, one way to think about bargaining is that on the one hand, it can be just you can imagine it, if you like, as win-lose, right? Completely, as you say, eye for an eye. Everything you gain, I lose. That's not the way, I think, to think about a real bargain. It's not even the way you would think about it if you were going into buying a used car. Right? I mean, if you go in to buy a used car, you don't think you're going to get the car for free and the used car salesman is going to get nothing, and vice versa. The used car salesman doesn't think he's going to get your money and not give you any car. You'll probably try to get.
I've had that experience.
Yes, exactly. No, we all have.
Never
Right. But if it works, you get sort of more car than the salesman wants, and he gets more money than you want. The point is, you're both better off inside the bargain than you are outside the bargain. And if we think of that in terms of politics as well, it requires that we recognize that we're trying to do something that the other party is going to get, something out of it. And that's good. I mean, that's the way it ought to work. So in a sense, it's transactional. We're each trying to get as much as we can, but we're recognizing that it is not zero sum, that we're both going to be better off if this really works out. And I think that's the breakthrough that we need to make now. I mean, the sad thing about American politics now is it's become not only transactional, but transactional in terms of this zero-sum game. Everybody who isn't a winner is a loser. Everybody who isn't my friend is an enemy. And I think that's really dangerous for democracy.
There's one more tense relationship. It comes back to something, Katharina, you were saying at the very beginning about the use of law. I think not all of us would think, I believe, that some form of rule of law is required for reciprocity, for collaboration, for cooperation, because there's also enforcement at some point. It doesn't only come out of norms. But there's also what the great analyst once of mid-century, or early mid-century Germany had to say, Ernst Frankl, in his book on the dual state, this rule by law, not only of law. And this boundary between rule of law and by law affects the meaning of reciprocity, the nature of bargains, the nature of coercion, the character of democracy. There was a question here, and why don't you come and ask it, please?
Very interesting talks.
And
I'm Katie
please
Young,
identify yourself.
Katie Young at the law school visiting at present, and I teach human rights law and economic and social rights. And my question is really based on the interaction between law and norms and institutions, because you've all given a kind of institutional story of democracy and the economy bounded by norms. And I'm curious, within human rights law, we rely a lot on naming and shaming as well as institutions of enforcement. And I kind of feel that at present we're in a phase of other codes operating. This links to the reciprocity question, but it's almost as though shaming is no longer attached to norms, and some kind of honor system or system of patronage or loyalty is really gaining so much ground within economies. And I would just really like to hear your perspectives as to see whether, with this rise of authoritarianism, very different structures, the book about tyranny, are we seeing a system in which shaming mechanisms are no longer as relevant, but different codes of behavior are really on the rise? Loyalty, honor.
Happy to start. No, I think that's right. I think that loyalty trumps legal commitments. We are taking apart a constitutional system, and people are cheering, and they have been also elected to be cheered. Those in the cabinet in particular. So I was hesitating a little bit about. I mean, I think you're right that in human rights context we're using shaming and have used this, and this can be you can shame even corporations, and especially if they are consumer facing. So this works under certain kind of conditions. But in some ways, that's I'm just wondering where the difference is. Does a different code of norms, right? Whether we do loyalty in kind of more mafiosi type structures, or we do social norms that work through shaming and exclusion. This is also common mechanisms. And so the question is how one shifts from one to the other, but they're both like informal mechanisms. The question is how they relate then to the rule of law. And I think that's a harder question, because I think most people who have studied rule of law from an institutional perspective would say that the rule of law can be maintained only if the informal norms also sustain that system. And if you deviate, I think, really from either direction, too much from that, then the ability to sustain those formal norms and have them deeply supported in society will be questioned.
isn't it shaming conventions that have got us into this mess in the first place? I mean, was Hillary Clinton trying to shame people by calling them deplorables? I mean, I think if you read Michael Sandel's book on like meritocracy, you know, Michael would say one of the problems in the United States at the moment is this sort of, you know, shaming people who didn't get into Harvard, or shaming people who only want to be truck drivers, or, you know, like, so I sort of get what you're saying, but I have a feeling that there's like multiple images of this here, you know, in society, and I don't claim to understand it myself, but it seems like that's something that's created immense kind of visceral anger, you know, and which is driving a lot of things at the moment.
We're at time. I want to close simply by, before thanking our dear colleagues, pose not for answering now. I think in the social sciences, ultimately, there's only one good question, which is the under what conditions question. That is, under what conditions can the kind of normative order in Eastern Nigeria operate successfully, or be reproduced, or scale up, or however you want to put the question. Under what conditions can a kind of a civic imagination intersect with pathologies of capitalism to create a more decent market economy, one where public law and civicness have a stronger democratic impulse than they currently do? And under what conditions can the kind of strong democracy, both rhetorical, social, and instrumental, all at once, that at its best, the rhetoric that we have from Athens reminds us existed, under what conditions can that world continue to inform a very different technological, et cetera, world of politics and economics? And if I may say, I think the central puzzle that underpins the work of our sponsor this evening, the Center for Political Economy, is precisely that. Under what conditions can we gain a fertile, a robust, and a achievable goal of a richer interconnection of economy and democracy? And for this, I thank the three of you, and thank you all for being here this evening.